Britain has just witnessed the moment no one thought would ever happen. After months of silence, King Charles has struck back. A royal voice that had stayed quiet during the political chaos has now broken through the storm. And what he said has left the entire nation in shock. Reports are flooding in from Buckingham Palace. Downing Street is scrambling for answers, and even Starmer's own party seems blindsided. This is not just another political headline. This is a royal intervention that could change the course of British politics forever. It began with whispers across Westminster. Early this morning, something was brewing inside the palace. Advisors were seen rushing in and out. Phone calls were being made to senior ministers, and journalists began circling like hawks. Then, without warning, the news broke. King Charles had issued a direct and unprecedented statement, one that openly challenged the leadership of Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The nation froze. The statement, measured but unmistakably firm, called for moral integrity, transparency, and the restoration of trust between government and people. But was the tone, sharp, deliberate, and undeniably personal, that sent shockwaves through every corner of British politics. For the first time since taking the throne, the king had spoken not as a ceremonial figurehead, but as a guardian of the nation's conscience. Inside Downing Street, panic quickly spread. Sources say Starmer's team was caught completely off guard. The timing couldn't have been worse. With scandals piling up, backbenchers reveling, and public confidence crumbling, the last thing Starmer needed was a rebuke from the monarch himself. Ministers reportedly argued over whether to respond or remain silent, fearing any reaction would only fuel the flames. But the damage was already done. Across social media, the moment went viral within minutes. Hashtags like #KingFuzma and #RoyalRebuke began trending globally. Clips of the king's statement were replayed on every major network, dissected word by word by analysts and commentators. Some called it courageous, others warned it was dangerous, a potential constitutional earthquake that blurred the sacred line between monarchy and politics. But for ordinary Britons watching from their living rooms, it felt like something deeper. A cry from the throne itself. For months, frustration had been building. People saw their bills rising, their streets filled with protests, their leaders consumed by scandals. Many believed the monarchy had turned a blind eye, choosing silence over principle. But now that silence was shattered. The king's swords were seen as a reflection of what millions had been thinking, but few dared to say that Britain had lost its way, and that its leaders had lost touch with the people they were meant to serve. Political insiders immediately began speculating about what drove the king to act. Some believe a recent private briefing about government misconduct pushed him over the edge. Others point to his growing unease over the erosion of public trust, a matter he has reportedly discussed with senior aides for weeks. Whatever the reason, this wasn't a slip of the tongue or a moment of emotion. It was deliberate, planned, and powerful. Even veteran politicians were stunned. A former cabinet member told reporters, "This is history. The last time a monarch spoke this bluntly, it changed the balance of power in Britain." Newspapers rushed to print special editions. By evening, the headline dominated every front page: King Charles strikes back. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds began to gather. Some cheering, others stunned into silence. Among them, voices shouted phrases like, "Finally, and the king speaks for us." It was clear this wasn't just a royal statement. It was a spark that reignited a national conversation about leadership, honesty, and the soul of the United Kingdom itself. In Parliament, MPs whispered in corridors. The opposition seized on the chaos, accusing Starmer of losing the confidence not only of the people, but of the crown itself. Conservative and Reform Party figures called it a constitutional moment of reckoning. Even within Starmer's own Labour ranks, cracks began to widen as murmurs of discontent grew louder. Some reportedly questioned whether the Prime Minister could survive this kind of blow. But while the political storm raged, the king remained silent after his address. No follow-up, no clarification. His words hung heavy over the nation, echoing through the night like a royal decree of judgment. Commentators described it as the calm after the thunder. Every newsroom across Britain stayed on high alert, waiting for Starr's next move, or a palace denial that never came. As midnight approached, Britain found itself staring into a moment of pure uncertainty. As centuries-old balance between the monarchy and government had just been shaken, and no one knew what would happen next. And yet, beneath the chaos, one thing was clear. This was not just a statement. It was a message, a declaration, that even the throne could no longer stand idle while Britain's leaders faltered. King Charles had spoken, and the entire nation was listening. Inside Downing Street, the atmosphere was electric, a mix of disbelief, anger, and pure panic. The Prime Minister's inner circle had gathered in the Cabinet Office, faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The King's words were still echoing across every news channel, every phone notification, every political conversation in Britain. For a government already walking on a tightrope, this royal rebuke felt like the ground collapsing beneath their feet. Sources close to the Prime Minister described the moment as total chaos. Staffers ran between offices clutching briefing papers. Aides argued over strategy, and Starmer himself was seen pacing the floor, demanding answers no one could give. How did this happen? Who knew? He reportedly snapped. But there were no answers, only silence and the sound of phones buzzing with incoming messages from MPs, journalists, and party officials desperate for direction. Within hours, leaks began emerging from inside Downing Street. Some claimed senior advisors had urged Starr to stand firm and issue a response, warning that silence would be seen as weakness. Others begged him to stay quiet, fearing any public statement might escalate tensions with the palace. It was a lose-lose situation. If he spoke, it looked like defiance. If he didn't, it looked like surrender. The political fallout spread like wildfire. Opposition leaders wasted no time. They appeared on live television, calling the moment a royal vote, a vote of no confidence. To former ministers, they accused Starmer of shaming the crown. Even members of his own party began whispering doubts about his leadership. Behind closed doors, the panic was turning into something far worse. Division. By mid-morning, reports surfaced that several Labour MPs were preparing to break ranks, holding secret meetings to discuss potential successors. The murmurs grew louder. If the king no longer trusts him, why should we? In the space of a few hours, Starmer's authority had gone from unshakable to uncertain. It was a political earthquake, and its aftershocks were spreading through every corridor of power. At the same time, the palace maintained complete silence. No clarifications, no denials, just the quiet dignity of a monarchy that had spoken once and saw none to repeat itself. That silence only made things worse. It gave the impression that the king stood firmly by his words, and that Starmer was left standing alone in the storm. Inside the media bubble, journalists smelled blood. Cameras swarmed outside Downing Street gates, waiting for any sign of movement. Rumors swirled that Starmer was preparing a televised statement to address the nation. But every time a plan was drafted, it was scrapped. Advisors warned that even a single misstep could turn public sentiment completely against him. "You're not fighting an opponent," one strategist told him quietly. "You're fighting the crown." Meanwhile, inside Labour Party headquarters, phones rang non-stop. Constituents were demanding answers. Party donors were panicking. Some local branches reported an immediate drop in morale. Members uncertain how to defend their leader after the king's public condemnation. The image of a confident, steady prime minister had evaporated overnight. By evening, as rain began to fall over Westminster, the prime minister finally met privately with his closest allies. Witnesses described the scene as tense and emotional. Starmer sat at the head of the long oak table, shoulders slumped, listening as one advisor after another laid out bleak options. "We can't fight the monarchy," one of them said bluntly. "We have to weather it, or it's over." But the question was, could they weather it at all? Across the country, television screens flickered with breaking news banners. Political commentators spoke in hushed tones about the beginning of the end. Polling agencies rushed out instant surveys, showing public confidence in government dropping at record speed. For the first time since taking power, Starmer's leadership numbers fell below the opposition. In private, senior civil servants were reportedly drafting contingency plans, just in case. The word resignation began appearing in internal discussions. Some ministers were already distancing themselves publicly, emphasizing their respect for the monarchy while carefully avoiding any defense of the Prime Minister. Loyalty was evaporating hour by hour. Then came the real blow. Buckingham Palace released a brief, but pointed message late that night confirming that the king stood by every word of his address. It was only a single sentence, but it was enough to crush any remaining hope inside Number 10. That statement sent shock waves through the political system. For many, it was the confirmation that this was not a misunderstanding or misinterpretation. The monarch had made his position clear, and it directly challenged the government's moral authority. In one short sentence, the balance of power, but the invisible line that had kept Britain's monarchy and government apart had been redrawn. By midnight, insiders said Starmer remained awake in his office, staring at a copy of the King's speech laid across his desk. Around him, the building was quiet, save for the soft hum of security radios outside. Britain's leader, once confident, once untouchable, now looked cornered and isolated. And as the rain continued to fall over London, one truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The Prime Minister's fight was no longer political. It was existential. He wasn't just battling critics or rivals anymore. He was battling history itself, and the weight of the crown that had just turned against him. The silence in Downing Street was deafening. The panic had turned to dread. And the question hanging over Britain was now unavoidable. How long could Starmer hold on before the entire system began to crumble? As dawn broke over London, the crisis that began inside Britain's borders had already exploded across the world. What started as the royal rebuke was now a global spectacle. The kind that stops presidents, shakes stock markets, and dominates every major news outlet from Washington to Beijing. The world had woken up to headlines declaring King Charles versus Prime Minister Starmer, and the ripple effect was immediate, fierce, and unstoppable. In Washington, the White House press room fell silent as reporters pressed for answers. Was America's closest ally falling apart? Could the British government even function amid such turmoil? A senior U.S. official speaking off the record admitted that Washington was deeply concerned by the instability in London. For an administration already managing global crisis, the idea of Britain, the cornerstone of Western democracy, tearing itself apart was unthinkable. Across Europe, reactions were equally stunned. In Brussels, EU diplomats were said to be in disbelief. The European Commission held an emergency briefing to assess how the British crisis might affect trade and security agreements. One EU source described the moment as a political earthquake not seen since Brexit. German and French leaders issued cautious statements emphasizing their respect for the British constitutional process. But everyone knew what that really meant. No one had any idea where Britain was headed next. In Moscow, the reaction was darker. Russian state media celebrated the chaos, calling it proof that Western democracy is collapsing under its own lies. Analysts on Kremlin-backed channels mocked the British establishment, portraying King Charles' statement as evidence of internal collapse. Even their king no longer believes in their government. One commentator sneered on air for Vladimir Putin's propaganda machine. This was a gift. A chance to show the world that Britain, the once mighty empire, had turned on itself. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the Chinese government's response was cold and strategic. State-run newspapers ran editorials questioning the stability and reliability of the United Kingdom as a global partner. Behind closed doors, diplomats quietly began reviewing long-term trade and security ties. Tottenham, a Britain divided between its monarch and its government, was a weakened Britain. Easier to manipulate, easier to ignore. But perhaps the most shocking reactions came from within the Commonwealth. Nations like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, countries where King Charles remains the symbolic head of state, were suddenly thrust into constitutional confusion. Could their monarch speak so boldly against his own government back home, and still represent theirs? The debate erupted across talk shows and parliaments alike. In Canberra, opposition leaders questioned whether Australia should now reconsider its tiesto, the British monarchy. In Canada, headlines read simply, "The Crown divided." The global media machine went into overdrive. Major American networks broadcast dramatic countdown graphics, treating the crisis like an unfolding movie. News and calls spoke of the end of the old order. While social media platforms were ablaze with theories, some claimed the King's statement was a calculated move, a final warning before the collapse of Starmer's government. Others believed it was spontaneous, an emotional act from a monarch pushed to the edge by what he saw as corruption and decay. Everywhere, the same question echoed: who truly leads Britain now, the Prime Minister or the King? International investors didn't wait for their answer. The pound began to fall sharply, and the London Stock Exchange opened to a wave of uncertainty. Billion-dollar funds started moving assets out of the UK, fearing political paralysis. Economists described the situation as a confidence collapse. The instability at the top was no longer just political, it was financial. The King's rebuke had shaken the foundations of trust that global markets depend on. At the United Nations, diplomats were reportedly stunned. Britain, once seen as the steady hand in global affairs, was now being discussed in the same breath as nations in political freeall. One European ambassador summed it up in disbelief. "This is Britain we're talking about. You know, the country that stood firm through world wars, recessions, and Brexit, and now it's coming apart because its king spoke his mind." Even allies who admired the king privately worried about the president. Could a monarch in the modern world openly challenge an elected leader without destabilizing democracy itself? Constitutional experts called it uncharted territory. Royal historians pointed out that not since the reign of George V had the British crown been drawn so directly into political conflict. The moment wasn't just about karma. It was about the future of the monarchy itself. At home, the British public watched as foreign leaders, analysts, and journalists debated their country's fate. The sense of national humiliation was palpable. Commentators on British radio spoke of a nation under global scrutiny, while others warned that the world abroad is losing faith in Britain's leadership. The story had escaped their borders, and now the world was judging them. By nightfall, the international pressure reached a boiling point. The U.S. Secretary of State reportedly called Downing Street, urging stability and transparency behind closed doors. NATO officials worried aloud that Britain's political meltdown could weaken the alliance's unity at a critical time. The message was clear: Britain's domestic drama was no longer domestic. It had become a global crisis, one that could reshape alliances, economies, and the very image of Western power. In just 24 hours, the King's swords had traveled farther and hit harder than anyone could have imagined. A single royal address had triggered what analysts were calling the Great British Shockwave. And as the world watched in disbelief, one truth became undeniable. This was not only Britain's reckoning. It was the beginning of a new chapter in global history. A chapter written not by politicians, but by a monarch who dared to speak when silence had become unbearable. But while the world reacted back home, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. Inside Britain, Fury and frustration were spilling into the streets. Protests were forming. The government was fracturing, and whispers of something even bigger were beginning to take hold. The country was on the brink. And now all eyes were turning back to London, waiting for what would come next. By the third night, the tension across Britain had reached its absolute limit. What began as whispers of unrest had now turned into the roar of a nation that refused to stay silent any longer. From London to Manchester, Glasgow to Cardiff, the message was clear. Enough was enough. The King's statement had lit the spark, but it was the people who had turned it into a firestorm. Crowds surged through city centres, waving flags, holding signs that read, "We want our country back." An election now. The chants grew louder with every hour that passed. Thousands gathered outside Downing Street, their voices echoing against the iron gates as police formed tight lines trying to contain a tide that could no longer be stopped. Britain was no longer merely divided. It was erupting. Inside government buildings, the walls were closing in. Ministers resigned one by one, citing a loss of public confidence. Cabinet meetings dissolved into shouting matches. Loyal MPs, who had stood by Starmer through every scandal, now began issuing public calls for him to seek a new mandate. For the first time in years, the Prime Minister faced not just opposition from across the aisle, but from his own party, his own people, and now from the highest seat in the realm. Reporters described the atmosphere in Westminster as revolutionary. Veteran correspondents compared it to the political collapses of other nations, moments when governments simply ran out of legitimacy. Parliamentary staffers leaked that private letters of no confidence were pouring in faster than they could be processed. In every office, every corridor, the word resignation hovered like a ghost. The palace, still silent after its last statement, loomed over it all like a shadow. Every network replayed the King's words in slow motion, as though trying to decode a hidden message. And yet, no one could deny what had followed. A chain reaction of truth, accountability, and rebellion. Whether he intended it or not, the King had given voice to a frustration that had been buried too long. Outside, the pressure only grew. Union leaders joined the calls for a national vote. University students organized massive rallies. Even former prime ministers, normally cautious and diplomatic, began hinting that an election was the only way to restore stability. Polling stations hadn't even been announced, but across the country, the people were already preparing for change. At Downing Street, the situation turned desperate. Starmer's security detail increased. Protests grew bolder, and the once composed leader appeared visibly shaken in his rare public appearances. When he finally addressed the nation, his words were careful, too careful. He promised unity of focus and moving forward. But his tone betrayed him. The confidence was gone. The man who once commanded Parliament now looked like a leader pleading for time that Britain no longer wanted to give. The speech did nothing to stop the tide. Within minutes, social media exploded. Hashtags like #GeneralElectionNow and #StarmerOut trended across the world. Commentators on every channel called it the breaking point. What had started as a royal shock had turned into a democratic reckoning. By nightfall, the protests outside Parliament swelled beyond control. Police barriers collapsed as tens of thousands filled the streets, their chants rising into the cold London air. "Let us vote," they shouted over and over, the words echoing against the Palace of Westminster like a drumbeat of history. For the first time in decades, Britain's political establishment was staring into the eyes of its own people and realizing they could no longer ignore them. Inside the Prime Minister's residence, the decision finally came. Surrounded by his most senior advisers, Starmer sat in silence, the weight of the nation pressing down on him. The chaos had reached a point of no return. The public had spoken. Parliament had fractured, the monarchy had drawn its line. Britain had demanded an election. And now there was no other path forward. Shortly after midnight, the statement was drafted, simple, final. Or the Prime Minister would dissolve Parliament and call for a general election. Within minutes, the news hit every screen across the country. Fireworks erupted outside as crowds erupted into cheers. For many, it was not just relief. It was vindication. The system, shaken to its core, had finally listened. Commentators called it night Britain reset itself. For some, it was the end of Star's era. For others, the beginning of something entirely new. But for everyone, it marked a turning point. The moment when silence turned to voice and power returned to the people. As dawn approached, the nation stood still. As Adel, the streets were calm again. The chaos fading into the soft light of morning. But everyone knew, and nothing would ever be the same. The king had spoken. The people had risen. And Britain, for the first time in a generation, was about to decide its own future once more. This was the breaking point.